Hello and welcome to another session in our teaching series, Hidden Facts in Biology. In this video, we are going to be talking about nervous coordination. And under nervous coordination, we'll be looking at reflex and voluntary actions. We are also going to be talking about conditioned reflexes and unconditioned reflexes. Firstly, let's look at the reflex and voluntary action. We'll talk about the reflex action first. Reflex action are also known as the involuntary action. This actions is a rapid or autonomic or quick response to stimuli, and they are not consciously controlled by the brain. There are specific characteristics of reflex action. What are these characteristics? The characteristics of reflex action include the following. Number one, it is a quick response. Number two, it is not under the control of the will. When we say it is not under the control of the will, what do we mean? We mean that it is autonomic. Number three, it is not planned. Number four, it involves minimum number of nerve cells. And number five, it ends at the spinal cord. Now let's look at some examples of reflex actions. Examples of these reflex or involuntary actions include blinking of eyes, peristalsis, that is the movement of food down the gastrointestinal tract, coughing, sneezing, salivation, withdrawal of hand from a hot object, and the secretion of glands. Having a look at what reflex action or involuntary action are, let's take a brief look at some voluntary actions and what they are. What are voluntary actions? Voluntary actions are responses to stimuli that are consciously controlled by the brain. The brain controls these actions. And what are the characteristics of these voluntary actions? The characteristics of these voluntary actions include, number one, it involves a prolonged response. Number two, it involves many nerve cells. And this is unlike the reflex action that involves minimum number of nerve cells. Number three, this response is controlled by the brain, unlike the reflex action that are autonomic and not under the control of our will. And number four, its response to a particular stimulus may vary. What are the examples of voluntary actions? Examples of voluntary actions include actions such as singing, driving, walking, writing, dancing, eating, running, reading, and typing. So have a look at what reflex action and voluntary action are. Now we'll be looking at another subtopic, which is the simple reflex arc. What is a simple reflex arc? A simple reflex arc is the simplest pathway in the nervous system by which stimulus is received and a response is made. It is the route which impulses have to pass through in order to bring about a reflex action. The reflex arc consists of the following parts. Number one, the sensory cells or the receptor organ. The sensory cell or receptor organ is responsible for receiving the stimulus. Number two, the efferent neuron or the sensory neuron is also known as the sensory nerve. This transmits nerve impulses from the sensory cells to the spinal cord or to the brain. The next component is the intermediate neuron. The intermediate neuron conducts nerve impulse from the afferent to the efferent neuron. The next component is the efferent neuron, and the efferent neuron transmits impulses from the intermediate neuron to the effector. And the last component of the simple reflex arc is the effector, which could be a muscle or gland. It's responsible for taking action. Now we are going to be looking at the diagram of a simple reflex arc. So in this diagram, we have the simple reflex arc. And in this diagram, we can see the sensory cells or the receptor organ. And here, the skin has been labeled as the receptor organ. And we can also see the sensory neuron or the sensory nerve fiber, which has been labeled there. So from the receptor organ, we go to the sensory nerve fiber. And from there, we see the intermediate neuron or the intermediate nerve fiber. And from there, we see the efferent neuron, which is the motor efferent nerve fiber, and then we can see the effector muscle or the effector organ. So this really shows us a simple reflex arc. That is the pathway in which stimulus is received and the response is made. Having looked at the simple reflex arc, now we are going to be going to the next subheading, which is the conditioned reflex. What are conditioned reflex? Conditioned reflex is a learned response after birth, and once these reflexes are acquired, they can be performed without thinking about them. These are reflexes we perform without thinking about them. Most of our behaviors are conditioned reflexes. That is, we do them without even having to think about them. What are the examples of these conditioned reflexes? Example include walking. When we walk, we don't think about it. We just walk. Another example is driving. Another example is reading. Another example is writing, swimming, etc. These are reflexes that we learn. And it takes a fairly long time to learn each of these skills. But once they have been mastered, they are performed very fast and efficiently without the individual thinking about them. That is, they become habits. A Russian biologist named Ivan Pavlov actually demonstrated the concept of this conditioned reflex in the year 1902 with an experiment carried out on dogs. Naturally, when food is placed before a hungry dog, the smell of the food causes saliva to flow in the mouth of the dog. In the experiment, Pavlov rang a bell each time food was ready for the dog. And after a long time of giving food with the ringing of the bell, the dog became conditioned to the sound of the bell. Pavlov observed that after some time, when the bell was rung, the dog still salivated. The dog has been conditioned to the sight and smell of food and sound of the bell. That is, in other words, even without the food, when the bell was rang, the dog still salivated. So this became a conditioned reflex. Any of the stimulus, such as sight, smell, or sound of bell, could stimulate salivation in this dog. This brings us to the conclusion that the training of domestic animals, such as dogs, cats, horses, is based on conditioning. The animals learn to associate spoken command or sound of whistles. Having looked at the concept of conditioned reflex, let us talk briefly on unconditioned reflexes. What are unconditioned reflexes? Unconditioned reflexes are reflexes a person is born with. That is, they are not learned. For example, when your hand touches a sharp object, you withdraw your hand from it. Such a reflex is not learned. Also, when your hand touches a hot object, you withdraw your hand from it. So, unconditioned reflex are reflexes that we are born with. So now, having a look at this concept of conditioned and unconditioned reflex, let us take a look at the differences between reflex actions and voluntary actions. So we have a tabular format in which we talk about the differences. On the left side, we have the reflex actions, and on the right side, we have the voluntary actions. Number one, for the reflex action, they have their actions in the hindbrain or spinal cord. While for the voluntary actions, they have their actions in the forebrain. For the reflex actions, the response to stimuli happens unconsciously and not consciously. While for the voluntary actions, response to stimuli is usually controlled. That is, it is done consciously. For the reflex actions, most of the reflex actions are inborn and are not learned. While for the voluntary actions, most of the voluntary actions are learned. For the reflex actions, the response to stimuli happens automatically and quickly. While for the voluntary actions, the response to stimuli is not automatic. It is a little delayed. Another difference is that for the reflex actions, few neurons are involved in the path of nervous impulses, and this makes the path shorter. While for the voluntary actions, many neurons are involved in making it a longer path. Another difference is that for the reflex actions, in some reflex actions, they can be converted to voluntary actions, while voluntary actions cannot be converted to reflex actions. The next examples we look at is just to talk about the types of reflex action and type of voluntary action. Examples of reflex actions are blinking of eyes, peristalsis, coughing, sneezing, salivation, withdrawal of hand from a hot object, and secretion of glands. While for the voluntary actions, examples of voluntary actions are singing, driving, walking, writing, dancing, eating, running, reading, and typing. So this brings us to the end of our teaching in this video. Now we are going to be looking at some questions in order to aid our understanding. Our first question is, which of the following actions is not a voluntary action? A. Stealing, B. Sneezing, C. Fighting, D. Cheating. The answer to this question is B. Sneezing is not a voluntary action. In other words, it's done outside of our will or unconsciously. The next question says, which of the following action is not a conditioned reflex? A. Walking, B. Blinking of eyes, C. Driving a vehicle, D. Swimming. Remember, we say that conditioned reflex is a learned response after birth, and it takes time to learn them, but once they have been learned, they are performed very fast and efficiently. Of the options given, the only one that is not a conditioned reflex is blinking of eyes, and that is B. All the rest options, walking, driving, vehicle, and swimming, are conditioned reflex. So our next question, it says, which of the following action is not a simple reflex action? A. Knee jerk, B. Blinking of the eye, C. Withdrawal of hand from hot object, D. Reading a book, E. Contraction of the iris. The answer to this question is D. Reading a book is not a simple reflex action because it is done with our consciousness. So our next question, it says, the simplest form of nervous pathway which links receptors with effectors is known as the A. Relay neuron, B. Reflex arc, C. Motor nerves, D. Sensory nerves. The answer to this question is B, and that is because the reflex arc is the simplest pathway which link receptors with effectors. So our next question, it says, reading the verdict of a case by a judge or magistrate is an example of A. A reflex action, B. An instinct, C. A conditioned reflex, D. A voluntary action. The answer to this question is D, as reading is a voluntary action. So our next question, it says, which of the following process is not an example of a reflex action? A. Blinking of the eye, B. Reading, C. Beating of the heart, D. Sneezing. The answer to this question is B. Reading. We have come to the end of the examples. Now we are going to be taking some exercises. These exercises were taken from our book, Hidden Facts in Biology. The answers to this question are also provided in the book, both in soft copies and hard copy. Get either of them to check if what you have answered is correct. Thank you for listening.